If your last name is Italian, there is a real chance it was built from the name of an apostle, not a nickname, not a coincidence, an actual patronymic chain that survived 1,000 years. Here are 10 surnames that trace straight back to Peter, to Paul, and to the earliest Christian communities of Rome, and what each one is quietly telling you about where your family came from. The story starts almost 2,000 years ago, in a Rome that was not yet Catholic in any official sense. It was a city of emperors, senators, and gods with 1,000 names. And somewhere inside it, a small, illegal, and deeply distrusted sect was meeting in private houses, in back rooms, in the homes of merchants who risked everything just by offering a room for prayer. At the center of that sect were two men who had never met before their final years, and who, according to church tradition, both died in Rome under Emperor Nero. Simon, called Peter, a fisherman from Galilee who Christian tradition holds became the first bishop of Rome, and Paul, a Roman citizen from Tarsus who had once persecuted Christians before becoming their most tireless missionary. Neither of them was Italian. Neither of them spoke Latin as a first language. Peter's own native tongue was almost certainly Aramaic, and his Greek name, Petros, was itself a translation of the Aramaic word kepha, meaning rock or stone, the same word Latin later rendered as Petrus, and Italian eventually softened into Pietro. And yet, over the following centuries, their names became so deeply embedded in Italian culture that they stopped being just personal names and started becoming the raw material for surnames, hereditary labels that identified entire families for generations, long after anyone remembered the original Aramaic word that started the whole chain. To understand why, you have to understand how Italian surnames were actually born. Ancient Rome had used a three-part naming system, the tria nomina, in which a citizen carried a personal name, a family or clan name, and a distinguishing nickname. But that system collapsed, along with the empire itself. For centuries afterward, ordinary people in the Italian peninsula had only one name, a baptismal name, usually the name of a saint, and often chosen because it was the patron of the local parish, the feast day nearest the birth, or simply a beloved grandparent's own name passed forward. As populations grew and villages became towns, one name was no longer enough to tell people apart. So a second identifier was added, the name of the father. A man named Pietro, whose father was also called Giovanni, might be recorded as Pietro di Giovanni. Peter, son of John. That preposition di, meaning of, is the seed from which an enormous share of Italian surnames grew. Over generations, families simply kept using their ancestors' baptismal name as a fixed, inherited label, and it stopped changing with each new son. Historians of Italian genealogy generally place this transition from a single changing name per generation to a permanent hereditary surname, somewhere between the 11th century, when the practice began appearing in wealthier cities like Venice, and the 15th century, by which point most Italian families, from nobility down to common laborers, had settled into fixed family names. By the time that process was complete, thousands of Italian families were permanently carrying the name of a father, grandfather, or founding ancestor who had once been christened in honor of an apostle, and no clerk, priest, or notary ever bothered to write down why a specific Pietro or Paolo had been chosen 4 or 5 generations earlier. The name simply survived, stripped of its original story, but never stripped of its origin. And there was no shortage of babies named Pietro or Paolo. Peter was venerated as the first pope, the rock on which the church itself was built, patron of an enormous range of trades. Fishermen, of course, but also bakers, bridge builders, butchers, harvesters, rope makers, watchmakers, blacksmiths, shoemakers, and stone cutters. He was invoked for longevity, for the papacy itself, and oddly enough, against rabies and fever. Paul was remembered as the great missionary, the apostle who carried the faith across the Mediterranean, patron of Rome itself alongside Peter, and also the patron of Greece and Malta, invoked in every corner of Italy where a parish church bore his name, and against the bite of snakes and venomous animals, a detail tied to a shipwreck story from the book of Acts. Parents named sons after the saint, whose feast day was closest to the birth, or after the patron of their town, or simply because that name carried protection and prestige inside a community where being known as the family of the Peter-devoted household, or the Paul family down by the church, meant something. Multiply that pattern across dozens of generations and thousands of villages, from the Alps down to Sicily, and you get a surname landscape where variations on Pietro and Paolo are still, today, among the most common family name roots in the entire country, showing up not just as standalone surnames, but folded into hundreds of compound and diminutive forms. The first name on this list is Di Pietro, and it is about as direct as a surname gets. It means literally of Peter or son of Peter, and it comes from exactly the pattern just described. A medieval ancestor who was the son, servant, or notable relative of a man baptized Pietro in honor of the apostle. Records of this surname and its close relatives appear across central and southern Italy, in regions where devotion to St. Peter was especially strong, because local churches or cathedrals were dedicated to him. The surname also spawned an enormous family of compounds that genealogists group under the same root. Pedretti in the north, Perilli and Perio further south, Petruzzelli in Puglia, Piersanti in the center, each one a slightly different regional dialect's way of shrinking or reshaping the same original name. If your family carries any version of this name, somewhere in the deep past, there was a specific, real man named Pietro, whose identity was so tied to his community that his own children were simply known as the ones who belonged to Pietro. That single naming decision, repeated by scribes and neighbors for centuries, became a permanent family identity, copied into baptismal registers, tax rolls, and eventually passenger manifests when descendants crossed the Atlantic centuries later. The second name is Petrucci, and it shows a different mechanic entirely, the diminutive. Italian naming culture loved affectionate shortenings and pet forms, the linguistic equivalent of calling someone Pete instead of Peter. Petruccio was one such pet form of Pietro, and Petrucci developed as the patronymic plural built from it, essentially the family of little Pietro, or the descendants of Petruccio. This surname is heavily concentrated in central Italy, particularly around Tuscany and Umbria, regions where Sienese and Umbrian noble and merchant families used exactly this kind of diminutive naming in the late Middle Ages. One branch of the Petrucci family even rose to rule the city-state of Siena itself in the early 16th century, under Pandolfo Petrucci, proof that a name born from an affectionate nickname could still climb all the way to political power. This surname tells a slightly warmer story than Di Pietro, not a formal, official patronymic, but a name born from familiarity, from a household or a village that knew its Pietro well enough to shrink his name with affection before that affectionate version hardened into a surname passed down for 600 or 700 years. The third name is Pietrangeli, a compound surname that fuses Pietro with Angeli, angels. Compound names like this were common in central Italy, where a child might be given two devotional names at baptism, one honoring St. Peter, the other invoking the angels or another saint, and later generations fused both into a single hereditary surname rather than keeping them as separate given names. Pietrangeli is concentrated in Lazio, the very region surrounding Rome itself, which makes sense. This was the epicenter of Petrine devotion, the region where the tomb of the apostle sat beneath what would eventually become St. Peter's Basilica, and where naming a son after Peter was not an abstract act of piety, but a direct, local, almost neighborly gesture toward the saint, whose relics were a short journey away. visited by pilgrims from across the peninsula and later, from across the entire Christian world. The fourth name is Mastro Pietro, and this one adds a professional layer to the devotional one. Mastro is the old Italian word for master or craftsman, so Mastro Pietro means roughly Master Pietro or Pietro the craftsman. Whoa. Occupational titles were frequently fused onto baptismal names in medieval Italian villages, especially in the south, where a single Pietro, who happened to be the town's master builder, master blacksmith, or master shoemaker, would be distinguished from every other Pietro in the parish by his trade, since a village might easily have 3 or 4 men sharing the same baptismal name at once. His descendants then carried both pieces forward as a single surname, and the pattern repeated itself under dozens of other trades: Mastrangelo, Mastro Giovanni, Mastro Domenico, each one freezing a specific ancestor's job title alongside his devotional name. This is a small but telling detail, because Peter himself was venerated as patron of several manual trades. A name like Mastro Pietro can sit at the exact intersection of 2 forms of devotion: the baptismal honor of the apostle's name and the patronage he was believed to extend over skilled labor. The fifth name moves the pattern into an even older register: Petrarca, along with its close relative Petrarca. Yes, the surname of the poet, Francesco Petrarca, known in English as Petrarch. Both names come from further diminutive and dialectal transformations of Pietro, built through the same medieval mechanism as Petrucci, but shaped by different regional speech patterns, particularly in Tuscany and the Marchi. What makes this entry worth pausing on is how visible the apostle's fingerprint remains, even in a name attached to one of the most famous literary figures in Italian history. Petrarch's own surname is, at its linguistic root, a diminutive descendant of Peter, a 900-year-old echo of a Galilean fisherman sitting quietly inside the name of the man who essentially invented the sonnet, as Europe would come to know it. That closes out the Peter half of this list, and now the story shifts to the other apostle whose name shaped Italian surnames just as powerfully: Paul. Where Peter's name in Italian became Pietro, Paul's became Paolo, descending from the Latin cognomen Paulus, a name that already existed in pre-Christian Rome, where it belonged to the aristocratic Aemilia family, a lineage that produced statesmen and generals, and simply meant small or humble, used within a household to distinguish a younger or smaller family member from an older relative carrying the same first name. When Saul of Tarsus took the name Paul after his conversion, he was, according to long-standing tradition, deliberately choosing a modest Roman name to reflect his new humility, moving away from Saul, a name tied to the first king of Israel, and toward a name that quietly signaled his transformation. In doing so, he attached Christian meaning to a name that Roman families had already used for generations. That dual identity, part old Roman aristocratic name, part apostolic conversion story, is part of why Paolo spread so widely and so fast once Christianity became Rome's dominant faith. And it is also why the name traveled so easily beyond Italy itself, surfacing across the Christian world in forms like Paul in England, Pablo in Spain, Pauli in Germany and Switzerland, and Pavel further east. The sixth name on this list is Di Paolo, the direct mirror of Di Pietro, of Paolo, son of Paul, alongside its close cousin De Paulis, built with a Latin possessive ending meaning belonging to the family of Paolo. This surname follows the identical patronymic logic already described, just anchored to the second apostle instead of the first. It is one of the most widespread Paul-based surnames in Italy today, appearing heavily across the central and southern regions, and it exists for the same reason Di Pietro does. Somewhere in the historical record, a real man named Paolo was significant enough in his community, whether through status, land, or simple family size, that his name became the fixed identity of everyone who came after him. The seventh name is Paulini, Another diminutive, this time built directly from Paolo the way Petrucci was built from Pietro. Paolini carries the sense of little Paolo, or son of young Paolo, and it spread widely enough to become one of the most recognizable Paul-derived surnames in modern Italy. Found from the north down through central regions, diminutive surnames like this one are a quiet reminder that these were never abstract, formal, official names imposed from above. They were the names neighbors actually used, the shortened, familiar versions that stuck to a family precisely because that is how people in a small medieval community really spoke about each other. The eighth name is Paoli, the plural patronymic form, essentially the family of Paolo, or the sons of Paolo, structured exactly the way Italian surnames built the plural family group pattern rather than the singular die pattern. Paoli is documented not only across the Italian mainland, but also in Corsica and southern France, where it became famous through Pasquale Paoli, the 18th century general and statesman still regarded as the founding father of Corsican independence and remembered for drafting one of the first constitutions in modern history to establish popular sovereignty. That detail matters because it shows how far and how durably these apostolic names traveled. A name rooted in first-century Roman Christianity was still actively shaping political identity on a Mediterranean island 1,700 years later, carried by families who had no idea, most of the time, that they were still speaking the name of an apostle every time they signed a document, that cast a vote, or introduced themselves to a stranger. The ninth name is Paolucci, built the same way as Petrucci, Paoluccio as an affectionate pet form of Paolo, hardened over generations into the patronymic surname Paolucci. It remains common across central Italy, particularly in the Marche and Abruzzo regions, and represents, alongside Petrucci and Paolini, one of the clearest examples of how casual, everyday affection for a name could survive for centuries, once it calcified into a fixed family label. These are not the surnames of people trying to sound formal or important. They are the surnames of people who simply lived next door to a Paolo or a Petruccio long enough that the nickname outlived everyone who remembered why it started. The 10th and final name pulls back from Peter and Paul individually and points toward the wider world of early Catholic Rome that both apostles helped create. Clemente. According to church tradition, Clement was one of the earliest bishops of Rome, often listed as the third or fourth pope, and later tradition remembered him as a disciple connected to the generation that had known Peter and Paul directly, inheriting leadership of the Roman Christian community in its most fragile and dangerous years, when practicing the faith openly could still mean execution in the arena or exile to a mine. The name Clemente, from the Latin clemens, meaning merciful, became popular precisely because of this figure, and it was later chosen again and again by men-elected pope themselves. 14 popes across church history have taken the name Clement, a symbolic gesture tying each new pontiff back to that same founding generation that stood quite literally in the shadow of Peter and Paul's martyrdom. As a surname, Clemente and its many regional variants spread across Italy for the same reason Pietro and Paolo did, parents naming sons after a revered early leader of the Roman Church, and those sons eventually becoming the fixed root of a family line. If Di Pietro and Di Paolo connect you to the two towering apostles of early Christianity, a name like Clemente connects you to the generation that had to build an actual institution out of their teaching, inside a city that was still, for the moment, trying to kill them for it. Taken together, these 10 names are not evidence of noble descent or secret bloodlines running back to Galilee. What they actually prove is something quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable, an unbroken chain of naming decisions made by ordinary families across nearly 2,000 years that kept the memory of 2 executed preachers and the community they left behind alive inside everyday language. Every time a Petrucci or a Paolini or a Di Pietro signs a form, orders a coffee, or introduces themselves at a family gathering, They are, without necessarily knowing it, repeating a devotional choice their ancestors made centuries ago in a small parish somewhere in central or southern Italy, long before anyone could have imagined that name eventually crossing an ocean, filling out immigration paperwork at a port, or appearing on a birth certificate thousands of miles from Rome. The apostles never had descendants in the biological sense, but in the sense that matters to a linguist, a genealogist, or anyone curious about where their own name came from. Peter and Paul have millions of descendants alive today, scattered from Naples to Corsica, to every Italian immigrant community built across the Atlantic and beyond. Carrying, in the most literal way a name can carry anything, the memory of the two men who are still credited with founding the church in Rome, and whose names, translated, shortened, combined, and passed down through 1,000 years of villages and dialects, never actually stopped being spoken out loud.